Welcome to Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. I'm Eric Flickinger, and we are going to continue our study into the promise, God's everlasting covenant. This is week number 8, lesson number 8, and it's looking at covenant law. We are delighted once again to have with us our special guest, Dr. Michael Hasel. He is the professor of Near Eastern Studies and Archaeology and director of the Institute of Archaeology at Southern Adventist University. Dr. Hasel, welcome.
It's great to be with you today.
Now, this subject, we start talking about law, and sometimes people go, oh, this is going to get complicated. Well, we're going to try to decomplificate it, or something like that. We're going to look at a text here in Deuteronomy 7, verse number 9. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse number 9. And let's see if we can kind of make this simple. Deuteronomy 7 verse 9 says, "Therefore know that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments." Now that sounds just a little bit like something Jesus may have said a little bit later in time, but before we head in that direction, I want to ask a question. God chose Israel to fulfill His promises to the nations around Him. Why would He choose Israel? What was special about Israel? What was significant about Israel? Why did God choose them and not someone else?
Well, there's two parts to this question that we could look at. For one thing, Israel wasn't particularly special. We know that at this particular stage of their history, they were coming out of the land of Egypt as slaves. Socioeconomically, they certainly weren't special. They were at the lowest rung of society at that time. They had been enslaved in Egypt for a very, very long time. They had been in Egypt for 400 years, as was prophesied earlier. And so God called them not because they were the greatest nation, it says, but because they were among the least. There's another aspect, though, here that is very, very important, and that is the covenant that God made with Abraham at the beginning. God's covenant with Abraham specified that He would make him a father of a multitude of nations and a father of a multitude of people. And this was the fulfillment. His grandson, Jacob, who ended up having his name changed to Israel, had sons. Those sons, during those 400 years, their families had grown into a great people in Egypt. And this was the fulfillment, part of the fulfillment of His promise to Abraham, that there would be a great nation that would come out of his descendants. So God is faithful to His promises. And even when His promises are fulfilled in a nation that He has blessed in Egypt by multiplying them and growing them into a nation, even when they are in a very difficult situation, God's grace steps in and pulls them out of that situation into Himself and into His fulfillment. So the second aspect of this is found in Deuteronomy 7:9, which you just read, that He's a faithful God, yes, keeping His covenant of love to 1,000 generations to those who love Him and keep His commandments. So this was the grace of God that is demonstrated here in pulling Israel out of that situation and establishing them as His people out of His love for them and His love for their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So God chooses this nation who is the least of the nations, and yet He wants to use them to reach all peoples, to be a blessing to all peoples. Walk through that with me a little bit.
Yes, eventually they are going to be a blessing to all peoples because of their witness to all peoples. And because the promise goes beyond the children of Israel to the promise of the Messiah who would come to die as the Lamb of God, who would come to die for everyone's sins, not just one nation's sins. Jesus was born just south of Jerusalem in Bethlehem. Jesus was born into a nation, but His mission went beyond that nation. And so what we have in Scripture here is a very clear, we read about this in Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7. It says, even those I will bring to my holy mountain, that's usually a reference to Zion or Jerusalem, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples, or all the nations. The temple in Jerusalem, the sanctuary that was in the wilderness before the temple, gave the plan of salvation that God had not only for the children of Israel, but for all the nations of the earth. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, we read, Jesus, because of his suffering and death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So those sacrifices that took place in the temple, those sacrifices that took place in the sanctuary, this was exemplified in the life of Christ when he died for the sins of everyone, not just for a particular people.
I want to move forward now to Monday's lesson. And on Monday's lesson, we find an interesting passage. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse number 13. It says, so he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. Now, as you've already mentioned, this covenant is one of grace, God's saving grace, which he showers upon people who quite honestly don't deserve it. How is that grace related here to the law, and how basic is the law to the covenant? How does that all work together?
Well, sometimes we have an aversion to law, and sometimes we have difficulty with law. But what is very interesting, I grew up in the north, in the upper Midwest. There were a lot of Amish folk up there, and we used to go down to Indiana and visit some of the Amish communities. And the Amish people have a saying, fences make good neighbors. And if we understand the covenant, among other things, as a relationship, then there are rules and there are boundaries that help define that relationship and help define that covenant that need to be drawn. I mean, how long would a friendship last without boundaries if there were no boundaries? How long would a marriage last without boundaries? How long would a business relationship last without boundaries? And taking it back to the analogy of the neighbor, what would happen if the neighbor comes by and simply takes tools out of your garage at random without you knowing about that and keeps them? What would happen if you're growing a garden and the neighbor just comes over and harvests your vegetables after you spent months growing those in the garden? We give vegetables to our neighbors, but there's a difference between giving those and having someone take them. So those rules, those laws are, I think, very important for the functioning of relationships. Without boundaries, without lines drawn, without rules that are established, people are going to have difficulty living in harmony with each other. Every government has to have laws. Every government has to have a system in place that keeps things in order. And God's government is no different. God's government is governed on the basis of love. The commandments are a transcript of God's character, and together they exemplify to us how we are to live. And for the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, where they had lived in a land that didn't follow those laws, God gave them this gift to show them how they were to live in harmony with his covenant.
And we talk about laws, and rightfully so, because it's difficult to have a covenant without that. But we live in a society today that has become increasingly relativistic. There's not so much right and wrong or truth as much as there is my view of things and your view of things. I have my truth and you have your truth. She has her truth and he has his truth. And so there's not that consensus on what is right. We have a multiplicity of norms that compete in this marketplace of ideas that we have today. How does law function in a society like the one we live in today?
Well, I think we can see that our society with this relativistic philosophy, some call it postmodernism, we're probably in a postmodern society today, but that challenges this notion, particularly when it comes to moral law, particularly when it comes to morality and ethics. We've grown up for almost 100 years now with this postmodern philosophy that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. And that comes out of a realization that God no longer is relevant. There's no longer a norm outside of ourselves that dictates what is moral and what is right. The great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who is some call the father of postmodernism, he was born in 1844, died in 1900, but he declared in one of his great statements, God is dead, or Gott ist tot in German. And when he said this, it wasn't a declaration of triumph at all for Nietzsche. Nietzsche grew up in a minister's home. He grew up in a Christian home. He turned to philosophy after the university pulled the rug out from under him in his faith with their materialist views of nature and the Bible. And what he was basically saying is, if God is no longer relevant in our society today, then there is no basis upon which we can establish morality and we can establish our government. But I want to challenge this for a moment. While we apply this in the moral and ethical sphere, we certainly don't apply this very much in everyday life, this plurality of truth, or this relativism. I mean, if you're going into surgery and you're having knee replacement surgery, let's say, or having an ACL replaced. My daughter had this done a couple of times, and we never found the surgeon coming in and saying, well, it's just about the journey that matters here, not really the outcome today. We had nurses ask her 3 or 4 times in preparation for that surgery which knee she had hurt during her soccer game. And there was a very, very clear understanding of which knee was going to be operated on. You want a physician who's not a relativist, but in science is going to be very, very focused on the task at hand and to repair that ACL or to replace it with another ACL. So this is something we don't operate, we don't operate in that way in science. And I think that we need to be careful that we live in a totalitarian, a total truth kind of way in which these things are clear, both in the moral aspect and also in everyday life.
The Bible very rightly says there's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And so we can come up with our own ideas of what truth is, but it really doesn't matter. What really matters is what God says. And He in His love and mercy shows us how we can be in a right relationship with Him. And that's part of what all this covenant is that we are studying. We're going to be back in just a moment to dig a little bit more into this subject, but I want to encourage you, if you haven't already done so, make sure you drop over to the itiswritten.shop website and pick up the companion volume to what we're studying right now, authored by Dr. Michael Hasel, a book called The Promise, God's Everlasting Covenant, and you will find some phenomenal additional information on there that will help you understand covenant law and so much more. We're going to be back in just a moment.
More and more people are watching It Is Written TV. They're watching their favorite It Is Written programs, listening to inspiring sermon series, and much more. They're watching them here, and even here. See for yourself why people are turning to It Is Written TV to watch their favorite Christian programs live and on demand. Watch It Is Written TV for free anytime on Roku, Apple TV, and at itiswritten.tv.
Welcome back. We are continuing our study of The Promise, God's Everlasting Covenant, and we're looking specifically this week at covenant law. Dr. Hazel, I've got a question for you. Why did God provide so much instruction for Israel in this covenant, and why were all of these instructions that he gave them for their good?
Well, when they came out of Egypt, they were coming out of a culture and out of a situation where habits had been formed, where things had been done in a way that was very different for them for many hundreds of years. And so now it was they came to a point where God was instructing them how to live in a covenant relationship with him. And in doing so, his covenant laws that we find in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus were not only aimed at their relationship with him, but also their relationship with others. They were an expansion on the Ten Commandments, if you will, which the first four deal with our relationship with God. The second half of the commandments, the last 6 commandments, deal with our relationship with one another as human beings. And God expanded upon those and went into some detail in describing to Israel and providing instruction for them on how to live life. By the way, the word law in the Old Testament is the word Torah. And the Torah can refer in Judaism to the first 5 books of Moses, but it also is a much broader word that doesn't only mean law, it also means instruction. So God, in providing the law, is instructing his people how they are to live in harmony with him and in harmony with each other. And so we have, many of these little minute laws that we read about following Exodus 20 that expand upon these things, dealing with issues of health. God's desire was that if they came out of the land of Egypt, that they would not suffer from the health, from the diseases that the Egyptians had. And so he gave them specific laws concerning health. They were to cleanse themselves, go through this ritual purification if they touched a carcass, if they were in certain circumstances. And these were laws that would help protect them. We don't think of this today because most of us bathe on a daily basis, or in most places, at least in our Western world. But that was certainly not the case in the ancient world. People did not bathe all the time. People didn't do those kinds of things. And so God put those things into place for the people so that they would be able to live in harmony with each other, and that they would also prevent diseases that would often come in not only what they ate, but in the cleanliness or lack of cleanliness in that particular part of the world.
And we're looking specifically at the covenant law this week. And when we look at the law, there's especially on Wednesday's lesson, we're delving into the stability of God's law, how God's law doesn't change. It's often been said that God's law is a transcript of his character. So when we look at the stability of God's law, how does that give us a better idea of God's essential nature, what his essential nature is, and what does it tell us about who God is?
Well, it's very interesting that the Ten Commandments are written in stone. They're written by God's own finger. And as an archaeologist, when we excavate in the Middle East, we don't find a lot of papyrus manuscripts, at least in most of the Middle East. In Jerusalem, we would not find papyrus because there's too much rain there. We found the Dead Sea Scrolls near the Dead Sea because this was a very dry climate. We find papyrus in Egypt because it's a very dry climate. But if you wanted to have something written with permanence, you would write it in stone. And we still find those inscriptions on stones today that give us that permanent record of a campaign, of a king's activities and events. So what God is doing is he's writing this in stone so that the Israelites would have it for perpetuity. And it's something that we still have today in our societies. The Ten Commandments give us the basis of the Western culture and the Western civilization and the way that we are still thinking today. But I want to look at something even more than than the Ten Commandments. Let's look at God in a much broader kind of macrocosm sense as the Creator God. He created things within physical laws. Just a few years ago, on August 21, 2017, we had a total solar eclipse over the North America, over the continent. That was the first time we had a total solar eclipse over the North American continent since 1979. And I remember being a young child in elementary school in 1979 as we witnessed that eclipse at that time. And our teachers told us, you will be in your middle ages when you see another eclipse over the North American continent. And I looked at them, I remember this distinctly, thinking to myself, how do they know that? They knew that because of God's laws that are constant and that are reliable and that take place. And sure enough, 3 years ago, we canceled the university. It was the first day of classes at our university, and the whole university, because the focal point was right here in the neighborhood of Chattanooga and Cleveland, Tennessee, where we live, we took the day off to witness this eclipse. And I remembered what my teachers had told me so many years ago. So God's laws are permanent. God's laws are sure. And because of this is a very important point. Because of this view of God and His creation and the permanence of these laws that fly in the face of this postmodern idea that truth is relative, we are able to practice science. We're able to look at these laws and predict on the basis of these laws what kinds of things happen in the scientific world. And this is extremely important, I think, because if you think about it, it's been pointed out that probably science, the way we know it today, or the way it emerged in the Renaissance period, could not have emerged in any other kind of culture but a Christian culture that takes God seriously and takes His nature as something that is immovable and very serious. Think about the founder of the field of physics. We usually refer to Isaac Newton as the modern founder of physics. He was a devout Christian, and he wrote more on the books of Daniel and Revelation and the prophecies than he ever wrote on physics, but most people don't know that today. They think of Isaac Newton as simply being the founder of modern physics. If we look back at chemistry and biology and astronomy, these were all Christians that founded these basic sciences, these hard sciences that we still use today. And this came out of a Christian worldview where we could explore God's creation and understand His creation from within a perspective of a God who has established laws that define the governance, not only of His government, but also how the universe functions and how life functions.
Yeah, these laws, as you mentioned, give us a insight into God. And one of the great aspects of who God is quoted, the verses in the lesson, in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, which says, "For I am the Lord, I do not change." And that's a good thing for you and for me. We can have faith. We can trust that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I want to go to Thursday's lesson now, and Thursday's lesson has an interesting title. The title is just 2 letters. It's if, and then a few little dots thereafter. If what? Why is this word so important when we are studying the biblical covenant?
Because the covenant that God initiates can only function if we respond to His invitation. It can only function if we reciprocate what He has given us as a gift in His covenant. And the word if is found particularly in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. If they obey, what's the context here? His commandments, if they obey. But we see it in a number of other verses here as well, and as is brought out in the lesson for Thursday. If we look at Genesis 26, 4 through 5, it says, "I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands. These are the promises to Abraham. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. In Leviticus 26, verse 3, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and perform them, then I will give you rain in its season, the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And the passages go on and on, mentioning the blessings that Israel would receive in following God's covenant. So the covenant, as with salvation, never negates the freedom of the will, never negates the freedom to choose. The Lord doesn't force people into a saving relationship with Him. He invites them into a saving relationship with Him. He tells them what that saving relationship looks like as He defines that saving relationship, because He's God and He's able to define that. And what we do, whether we follow these obligations, whether we follow these conditions of the covenant, that is up to us, that is up to our decision. But should Israel obey, her obedience would be an expression of what it is like to be blessed by the Lord. And we can see that in history as well, that people who follow the Lord are a blessing to those around them.
And that's something, of course, that God gives each one of us the opportunity to do. First of all, to follow Him, and as a result of that, second, to be a blessing to those who are around us. And so my hope and prayer is that as we are studying this quarter's Sabbath school lesson, as we're digging into the promise, God's everlasting covenant, that we are making decisions, I'm making decisions, you are making decisions to take part in our part of the covenant. God doesn't change. He shared with us how we can be blessed, and He wants to bless us, but ultimately, the choice is ours. Ultimately, it's up to you, it's up to me. Are we going to trust Him? Are we going to have faith in Him? Are we going to believe what He has said, regardless of what the rest of the world around us may be doing and believing when it comes to relativism and so forth? God is the same. He doesn't change. His desire for you doesn't change. His desire is that you can live a life of abundance today and that you can spend eternity with Him in heaven. Dr. Hausel, thank you once again for joining us this week on Sabbath School. We're looking forward to having you back again next week, and we, of course, are looking forward to having you back again next week with us as we dig deeper into the promise, God's everlasting covenant. We'll see you then. God bless you.